timing of things like the Kennedy assassination, as LSD starts to, move its way into the culture. These are all the kind of landing coordinates. So with that, she talked to me about what was in fact the fundamental experience of his life and her life for that matter. In 1969, in the autumn of 1969, they'd been driving out of London in early evening and had a UFO experience. They'd seen a really profound visual display. They'd stopped the car, got out and had a look, and this thing had gone on for like 20 minutes. There was all these kind of spheres of light flying about, little things flying out of them, rejoining them. The whole thing was a kind of overwhelming emotional experience for both of them.
Welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore mysticism, esoterica, and the world of the spirits, and everything in between. For episode 56, we are joined by author Paul Weston, and in an idea-laden show, we cover the significance of one's own landing coordinates, one's place in the timeline, and what's happening around you in your formative years. And Paul takes us through his landing coordinates, growing up in the 60s and on into the 70s, and takes us through the concept of hauntology, which he has many thoughts on. Now, unfortunately, the computer fan on Paul's computer temporarily joins the conversation in places, but please bear with us because it's only an intermittent intrusion. We segue into an uncovered lost UFO experience, an unpublished book from a Glastonbury stalwart, and his own book that resulted from that experience. We discuss how Glastonbury, being a beacon connected with extraterrestrial gnosis, was actually a far bigger factor in how it developed into a new age mecca that it now is in the 70s. We then come back around to discuss patterns through time that manifest in culture and talk through the 90s and the importance of that time and how we believe it's still yet to manifest. We reminisce somewhat on our youth in the dance music of the time. In the plus section of the show, we talk about systems of control becoming more visible to the public and how this is tied to patterns through time, and a very Terence McKenna idea of the long sine wave going back into antiquity of recurrence of cultural patterns that play out. We discuss how empire is really dropping the mask and really how every generation has that experience of understanding what empire is and the impact of that awareness. We touch on Alan Greenfield's work and again talking about kind of classic UFO entities and the parallels with telemic entities of note. And we wrap up on the diamond, creativity and building the information exchange with the higher guardian angel, and how one's sense of identity is not limited to time and space coordinates, but there is a bigger, wider thing playing out that you're part of, which really circles us back to the start of the show and one's own landing coordinates. It's really interesting. It's good stuff, and the plus show section is really excellent. We really do go deep in this, so it was quite enjoyable listening back and editing this show. If you want to hear the Plus show, then sign up to the Patreon and you'll get the Plus show along with a host of other benefits. If you do like Spirit Box, you can also buy me a coffee via my Link3. I'm always interested in people's experience with the other, from hauntings to shadow people. So if you have a story to tell, reach out and tell me, either on Patreon or Twitter or Insta. Okay, let's get on with the show. Paul Weston, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the Spirit Box.
And it is a pleasure for me to be here with you to discuss all manner of interesting things, I hope.
Well, I'm delighted to have you on the show. And I first became aware of your work many years ago when a mutual friend of ours, through photography actually, knew of my interests and kind of said, oh, yeah, I know someone in Glastonbury. He's a Glastonbury-based photographer I know, and kind of introduced me first to your stuff. And so I've been following you for some time. So it's a real pleasure to actually
Right. That's
meet
nice to know. Yeah.
meet you in inverted commas over Zoom, as it were, and really great to have you on the show. Um, I guess to help um, orientate people and grease the wheels, it would be great if you could tell the listeners a bit about yourself and your work.
Okay. Well, I'm Paul Weston. I've been in Glastonbury for now 26 years. I'm the author of 11 books. I will list them. Mysterium Artorius, Arthurian Glastonbury Grail Studies, Alistair Crowley in the Inner Horus, Avalonian Eon, which is autobiographical, has an awful lot of psychic question material in it. The Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries Ufology, of which I'll have a bit to say in the course of this conversation. Glastonbury Psychogeography, the Michael Line, the Kabbalah and the Tarot. Atagartis, which is also very autobiographical and full of psychic question material. William Blake and the Glastonbury Gnosis. History and Myth, which I'll also be saying a little bit about today, and Glastonia Egypticus, which is the account of Andrew Collins' psychic questing adventures in Glastonbury back in the 1980s. So there's all that and a general broad interest in a wide range of subjects, as is probably indicated by that list of titles. You know, I'm a tour guide, I'm a lecturer, I've got a fair amount of material out there on YouTube as recorded lectures. I've appeared on the likes of Gordon White's Room Soup on a number of occasions. So there's a few people out there that have a sense of my interest in synchronicity, my interest in magical diaries and dates, and my inspirations, the likes of Robert Anton Wilson and everything that he writes about, obviously Crowley Gurdjieff, Colin Wilson, etc. So I'd like to think that's enough to broadly introduce.
I think that we'd have some very, very satisfied listeners with that resume. I think we'll be. I think we're right on the right street here.
Oh yeah,
yeah. There's some heavy hitters in terms of subject matter, and people in the subject matter of the books that you just listed. Some really interesting people there with some incredible bodies of work. And what I really wanted to ask you about is, because in our email exchange in the build up to this show, you mentioned Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah.
And Robert Anton Wilson, I guess, was one of my entry points into kind of this world as a whole.
Gateway drug.
Yeah, exactly. Which I'm sure he'd be very proud to be described as.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I kind of remember kind of like stumbling through his novels as a kind of my late teens, and kind of not really understanding them, but still be kind of struggling through and kind of being drawn to them and knowing they meant something. You know, like the Illuminatus trilogy and what have you. And you mentioned Raw in our email exchange.
Yeah.
And I kind of Operation Mindfuck in particular. And I think really just to kind of get the conversation going, I'd really like to kind of just, you know, for you to paint that picture of
Okay, yeah. What I think's interesting, first of all, that we're talking on the night of the full moon, and the actual moment of the full moon was about 10 minutes ago. And tonight, I don't know if you're aware, there is a cosmic trigger event going on in cyberspace because the text of the play that Daisy wrote, published, they've got a general thing going on right now. Now, Cosmic Trigger 1 is my most read book. I've read it at the last count 29 times. I mean, that is over a period of nearly 40 years. It's a massive influence on my autobiographical writing and my book, Alistair Crowley and the Inner Horus. But where I'm coming at, I think, tonight is Cosmic Trigger 2, Down to Earth, which is obviously a book that came out sometime later. I've not read it 29 times, but I've probably read it about a dozen times. And the thing that I really liked about it was that RAW emphasises the importance in one's own kind of biography of what called the formative influences, the landing coordinates, the kind of stuff that's going on around you, in the first 10, 20 years of your life in the bigger world, whether it's politically, culturally, and so on. So for him, a major moment is seeing the King Kong movie in 1933. It might seem a bit, cheap to us now, but to people then, it was absolutely mind-blowing. It was an entry into another world. He says the same thing, about The Wizard of Oz, seeing that in Technicolor on the screen in 1939. That's that's as important as an experience as what you're seeing in the newsreels of what's going on in the bigger world and the various intellectual developments, and the timing of things like the Kennedy assassination, as LSD starts to, move its way into the culture. These are all the kind of landing coordinates. So I've always been very interested, in keeping record of my own life. And I'm the kind of person that looks back on their own childhood and their own adolescence and primed by this down to earth and the landing coordinates, I started to really think how more and more how significant it was that having been born in 1959, my first decade is in the absolutely extraordinary 1960s. So as part of the backdrop of just what I take in, is this massive sense of expansion. The space race. We've just about, I'm barely a couple of years old and up goes Yuri Gagarin. By the time I'm 10 years old, I'm getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. We all believed that was true then. Not everybody does now, but it was a massive thing. And all the way through the 60s, you have uniquely charismatic icons, people like the Beatles, people like Muhammad Ali. And there's nobody in the world now remotely on the same kind of level of game as those guys were, in terms of just their impact, their charisma, the sheer voltage that they're putting out. So to be just a child gradually emerging into this, having it all around them, I'm just about old enough. I watched the first episode of Doctor Who. I can just about remember that. I saw the early William Hartnell Doctor Who. So all the TV, Thunderbirds, or my parents used to watch The Avengers. And I watched the first few episodes of The Prisoner, and I watched that. And it really freaked me out. And I didn't like it. But it was all mulling about in my head. And then in 1968, I was 9 in 1968. And I've really kind of come to this realization that was the year that I really became aware of a lot of things going on in the wider world. My birthday is the 5th of April. So I remember waking up that day in 1968 playing with a toy car on the carpet and hearing on the radio news that Martin Luther King had been murdered. Now, I didn't really have a full understanding of who he was, but I knew that something had happened that was a real big deal. And I remember Bobby Kennedy being shot dead, not that long afterwards. And I remember when the Russians went into Czechoslovakia and what a big deal that was. I mean, I remember it because an early episode of the TV comedy Dad's Army was cancelled and they put a documentary on. So I thought, well, this must be pretty serious stuff. And I remember the Olympics. I remember the Black Power salute, and I remember Apollo 8 at Christmas time and the iconic shot of the Earth moon. And I remember things like the Rolling Stones on Top of the Pops, or a video of them doing Jumping Jack Flash. And I remember Arthur Brown doing Fire. And I look back on it and I think that is a real powerful series of kind of influences to all be at play on the consciousness of a 9-year-old. We know 1968 is a gigantic year, of course we do, but the mystery of it and how it primes you for what you're going to be interested in later on in your life and how you're going to respond to it. And moving into the 70s, I turned 13 in 1972. So my entire teenage years are framed within that decade. Now, I know decades, our time scale, our calendar system can be seen as very arbitrary. It's not ultimately natural and just, the way all the numbers play out. But there's no question that there is a distinct kind of thing about the 60s, 70s, the 80s. I mean, some people will say, the 60s really started in 1963 and they lasted till 1973 and things like that, broadly speaking. So I turned 13 in 1972. David Bowie does Starman on Top of the Pops a couple of months after I turned 13. I turned 20 in 1979. Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister, shortly after that. So all of this is kind of very, very distinct. So this was my broad consideration. And I then found it very, very kind of interesting, that all of this configures with also a sense of locale, of location. Now, you had David Southwell on a little while ago. I hail from the same neck of the woods as him. So my, early psychogeographical input, if you like, is from the unique situation of South East Essex, where you've got a combination of a history, the Thames Estuary, Viking battleships, Viking settlements, the Battle of Benfleet, all this kind of stuff. It's now coming out in the series, Lost Kingdom, which has moved from BBC to Netflix. But that period of time, not that well known to most people, but very, very part of the deeper landscape and just the vibe, the nuances of that whole area. You've got Hadley Castle, medieval castle fallen into ruin, the kind of place where young people will go over the course of the weekend in the night if they're going to smoke a few spliffs and do some acid or whatever. And the whole thing, looking out over the Thames Estuary and gradually getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And, at the time, late 80s, early 90s, psychic questing and so on, going out there out into the woods, out into the hills, down to people that are psychic, that are, picking up stuff about Saxon shamans, that are picking up stuff about this cunning man, James Murrell. That was his stomping ground. Little geezer, 5 foot tall in a stovepipe hat and a great long coat and a telescope. He used to be a grimoire magician and a cunning man as well. All of this stuff with a backdrop of the spill out from London. Like practically everybody in South East Essex have all escaped from London. And back in the 60s, everybody claims to know the Cray twins. You've got this kind of real weird mix of stuff. And it all becomes formative. So it's with all that in the background that when I first started hearing about hauntology and reading about it, there was something about the focus on the 1970s as a very mysterious time that kind of clicked in my head. I read Mark Fisher's Ghosts of My Life and Simon Reynolds' Retromania back to back in 2014. And there was a whole kind of thing going on there that really, really fascinates. So okay, hauntology. This emerges as a term, as an idea in 1994 with postmodern French thinker Derrida, who writes this book, Spectrum Marxism. Now, it's in response to a guy called Francis Fukuyama, who had written a book called The End of History, in which he very contentiously claimed that basically, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the dismantling of the old USSR, that this was the definitive triumph of, liberal Western capitalism and democracy. It was, in fact, the perfect system that could not be bettered. It triumphed. Marxism was dead. Now, this obviously extremely contentious, some would say borderline absurd, but it was a big, talking point at the time, and there were a lot of people who kind of felt broadly along those lines. And the reader came along and he used this term, the spectrum Marxism, which kind of echoes way back to 1848 when Marx and Engels first came up with the Communist Manifesto. Marx said that there is a kind of spectre of communism haunting Europe. So the reader has kind of come back to that. Now, like psychogeography, it's interesting that the couple of terms that start off with obscure French thinkers, when they've crossed the channel and started to be thought about and discussed by English thinkers, it kind of mutates a little bit, and what you have when it comes to the way it plays out amongst the likes of Mark Fisher is the idea that we're kind of haunted with a strange nostalgia for a whole bunch of potential futures that never quite arrived. That there's something that we've kind of lost that we could have had, and in fact, if we kind of work with the retromania creativity, we can refashion out of the elements that were involved in those things something new that maybe gives us a sense that we are, recreating and reconnecting to that. And a lot of the thinkers that have discussed it have focused on the 1970s. The 70s was a very strange decade, and in terms of the culture that a lot of people, that the teenagers and so on at that time, you've got a golden age of what's now discussed as folk horror and so on in TV, programs like Children of the Stones, that evoke a kind of a strange, mythic, occult, sci-fi blend relating to ancient sites, that weave in the paranormal and earth mysteries, ley lines, the whole thing. And this is kind of the culmination of something that's brewing all through the 60s, what I've broadly called psychedelic earth mysteries, ufology. And when I read all this, I was captivated by it. I was infused by it. And I even made a little video at the time called Hauntological Reverie, where I put together a whole bunch of visuals from things like Doctor Who and the Daemon and the Stone Tapes and Children of the Stones, and Sky and the Wicker Man, and bits out of the Glastonbury Fair music festival and a whole bunch of things, and put them with the music of Belbury Poly. Now, Belbury Poly are part of the Ghost Box setup, and they deliberately use, tech from the 70s to create music that is evocative of that period of time, and is kind of like another development of something that seems to sort of been stillborn but carries on through these kind of means. And what was really kind of unusual about that period of time was that this 2014 immersion came right in the middle of what could be considered to be a hauntological episode of my own, which connected me back into Glastonbury in the 60s, the kind of a lost future. And this was my immersion in the works of a guy called Tony Roberts. Now, he's probably best known for being the editor of an anthology called Glastonbury, Ancient Babylon, New Jerusalem, which came out in 76 and was like the high water mark of the dissemination of mystical ideas about the Glastonbury landscape, primarily the so-called Glastonbury Zodiac, which was a concept that was developed by a mystic sculptress called Catherine Maltwood in the 1920s and 30s. The idea that there are literally in the landscape band here, partly as works of nature itself, but also sculpted by humans, effigies that represent different signs of the zodiac, and they're kind of the imprint of some mystery cult or whatever. This idea circulated in the late 60s and into the 70s, alongside ideas about ley lines, alignments, so on and so forth. It went off the boil. The high watermark was 77, and the problem was that there's just no kind of real archaeology and documentation to back it up in the way that we can now say there is with others. But what I came to know, and this was a right strange old combination of circumstances. Tony Roberts had done all this. He was a very interesting guy. He had also written a book called The Dark Gods. A guy called Jeff Gilbertson. This was like a real paranoid. You'd think of it as the kind of stuff these days that in its more mediocre forms is expressed in conspiracism about the Illuminati and Lovecraftian demonic monsters. You know, this was a more principled take on all this, informed by the work of John Keel and Jack Valley and a whole bunch of stuff. But this is what Tony was known for, and he famously died of a heart attack on Glastonbury tour in 1990 during an eclipse of the full moon. You know, which is quite a remarkable transition.
That's
So I
insane.
was, yeah, this is February. It was in daylight. It was in the morning, February 1990. So
Mm.
this was, you know, he was a very interesting guy. He started off as a kind of anarchist. He got arrested back in the early 60s for trespassing on an American air base as part of nuclear protests. You know, he'd met his wife at a rally in Trafalgar Square protesting against the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. So that's a long time ago. You know, it started a fire in the foyer of the Dorchester Hotel as a protest against capitalism. Imagine how that get dealt with these days. You know, so he's quite an interesting guy. And I wrote about him in my Avalonian Eon. And while I was finishing the book, I came to realise that his widow was actually the person in charge of the Montessori school that my oldest son was attending at the time. So I introduced myself and said, "Look, you know, I know Tony's work, I'm writing about him, you know," and we struck up a friendship. And when I got the book out, I arranged to meet her in a cafe in Glastonbury and to give her a copy. And I'd also written a little bit about Tony in Aleister Crowley and the Inner Horus that had come out in 2009. Now, I was sitting there in this cafe, the 100 Monkeys in Glastonbury High Street with her. And I said, well, I didn't really say that much about the Dark Gods in Avalonian Eon, but I did say more about it in my Aleister Crowley and the Inner Horus. Now, at that point, I realised that she's staring over my shoulder, looking at something behind me. Now, it turns out the original copy of the Dark Gods had some artwork on it that depicted the face of Aleister Crowley in the kind of cloudy sky above, you know, the roofs of cottages in a Somerset town. The guy that did that artwork, who she hadn't seen in 20 years, was sitting behind us over the other side of the cafe at the very moment that I mentioned that. And I thought, well, that, you know, says to me that there
Wow.
is a mysterious connectedness
Mm.
that is going on here. You know, Tony Roberts, very, very different temperament to me, but, you know, something was going on there.
Yeah.
So with that, she talked to me about what was in fact the fundamental experience of his life and her life for that matter. In 1969, the autumn 1969, they'd been driving out of London in early evening and had a UFO experience. You know, they'd seen a really profound visual display. You know, they'd stopped the car, got out and had a look, and this thing had gone on for like 20 minutes. There were all these kind of spears of light flying about, you know, little things flying out of them, rejoining them. The whole thing was a kind of overwhelming emotional experience for both of them. And within a couple of days, you know, he works in London. He goes into town, commutes on a little moped, and he gets knocked off it by a car, which means that he's got like 6 months off work. And it's like he has this massive download, and he just goes into this spur of writing of this gigantic text, which, you know, provisionally called Giants in the Earth. which is like an expression of what I'd call Earth mysteries ufology. There's a whole bunch of stuff knocking about at that time, including from a guy called Brinsley Paul Trench, who's kind of known. He was in the House of Lords. You know, he's the most socially prestigious UFO enthusiast. He'd written as far back as 1962 that the Glastonbury Zodiac had been, you know, created with the help of ETs. That it was some kind of beacon. That it was some kind of prophecy of the Aquarian age. You know, and Tony knew about all this stuff, and he fed on a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it is kind of pulp fiction, some of it is occultism, some of it's come from Blavatsky, some of it's come from the early days of ufology, the likes of Desmond Leslie and so on, Atlantis, Lemuria. He tries to range over the course of the whole world, but he basically sets this enormous thing down. The Glastonbury Zodiac is like 10,000 years old. It's been created by Atlantean refugees with the help of ETs. It's absolutely wild, and to some people it would be, you know, an annoyance to even read it. But I've got a kind of affinity towards that kind of stuff, and a fascination for the fact that this thing has kind of come out of him, and it's a massive text. He never finished it. If he published it in a normal sized paperback, it could easily be 500 pages. And he goes into this for a couple of years, and it's never published, but there's a couple of things mined out of it. There's a book that he wrote called Atlantean Traditions in Ancient Britain, and another one about giant lore called So Is the Thunder, which is broadly extracted out of the Motherlode. But essentially, no one had seen this text, you know, since 1971, and I ended up being the first person outside of the household to actually read it all the way through. And what I realised was that this psychedelic Earth mysteries ufology, this sense of Glastonbury as being some kind of, you know, beacon connected with extraterrestrial gnosis, if you like, the kind of stuff that they now talk about on Ancient Aliens, was actually a far bigger factor in what happened in the development of this place into the New Age mecca that it now is in the 70s. You know, the book, the anthology, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, simply would not have existed were it not for his impetus of having that experience. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't talk about it in that anthology anywhere. I think UFO gets a brief mention once, but this massive experience is absolutely fundamental to him. So I was asked, you know, there was an idea to do a new edition of Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, and Jan said, "Well, look, can you write an introduction to it and talk a bit about Tony's experiences?" And I was totally up for that, and I got the artist Yuri Leach, who's worked on a lot of my book covers. We created a new version of the original cover, which was kind of like a Glastonbury version of the Crowley Sun Tarot card with Glastonbury Tour in the middle and the signs of the Glastonbury Zodiac all around it. I was gonna, you know, I was intended to collaborate with someone else in Glastonbury to get this thing out. Now that stalled, and it started to look like maybe it wouldn't come out in that form. I started to wonder, because I briefly had a period where I had some extra money, what it would be like to literally, because there's only one copy of this thing. He's created this kind of hardback thing. He's glued all the pages together. There's all this artwork. It's a real personal thing. You'd have to scan every single page. But I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if you got this thing out and I got Yuri to do a cover that was like all these ancient astronaut books that were out there in the early 1970s? That this thing is actually a genuine artifact of exactly that period. It is somehow an expression of a whole zeitgeist that is present in the background of Glastonbury, and yet a lot of the general public and a lot of the people that have looked back on the ideas don't even know about. It's literally some kind of lost future that was always there. You know, Tony and Jan were good mates with Jamie George in Gothic Image. If that book had actually been finished and published in 1971, it would have been disseminated from Glastonbury all through the 70s. And it would have become part of people's understanding of what they thought about the place and what it was all about. And this seemed to really fit in to me with my sense of the hauntological mystery of the emotional tone of the kind of the lost futures, the lost thought patterns, the lost ideas that are still kind of there in some kind of liminal zone, waiting to be resurrected by coming back round to them with the same attitude again and being creative with them. So it became absolutely ridiculous to even consider this thing could be published. And then I'd already arranged that I would talk about Tony and his experiences at the Glastonbury Symposium, that's still better known as the Crop Circle Conference in 2015. And I suddenly thought, well, I wonder if I could turn my introduction into an entire book, you know, in the amount of time it would take to finish it and get it actually launched at the lecture that I'm giving. And this, I went into hyperdrive with this, and I actually did it. You know, this is what the roots of my book, Glastonbury, Zodiac and Earth Mysteries and Ufology, are. And the cover art that was originally intended, you know, the Glastonbury Crowley Sun card, Glastonbury Zodiac, that's the cover of the book. And I launched it, and it was with the sense that somehow this work and these ideas of Tony's were always part of the psychosphere of Glastonbury, but they were kind of lost, but they were still part of what the actual authentic 1970s gnosis of Glastonbury was. And I found that, you know, there were just so many nuances in that for me to ponder about in terms of like the culture of the time, how you know, engage with it again and all the different options that you've got to creatively work with it and re-express it. You know, I don't believe the Glastonbury Zodiac is 10,000 years old. I don't believe that it was created by extraterrestrials with the aid of extraterrestrials and Atlantic refugees, but I do believe that there's something incredibly mysterious about it. And I know from my own experiences, from the experiences of Andrew Collins, if you get your head in gear and you start thinking about this and you interact with it, in other words, you actually go to these places, you do stuff, you push the boat out. You know, if you read my Avalonian Eon, Andy took us for a 36-hour vision quest around it in 1990. You know, I jumped in a weir at midnight, things like that. Things happen. You know, there is a very mysterious voltage, a very mysterious power in this. So I was, you know, I had all of this stuff, you know, hauntology and my own sense of the 70s and so on, going on. And I thought, well, yeah, you know, I think I get it. I think I broadly understand it. But then suddenly I came back round on another twisted spiral and came to feel that I'd kind of brought the whole thing of hauntology and the mystery of it into an expanded perspective. And this happened really as a result of a book that I got out last year, History of Myth, which yeah, I've talked about this before, so I only need to very, very briefly say, you know, how that was set off, which was in the election campaign. Boris Johnson was supposed to come to Glastonbury. There were protesters here. He was frightened off and went to the nearby town of Wells, which is in the same constituency. And I realised that he'd visited Wells on the exact date of the trial of Abbot Richard Whiting, who was the last abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, and was hung, drawn, and quartered the next day on top of Glastonbury Tor, which is, you know, the great tragic event that we've got hanging in the airwaves here. And I just started to think about the way you could compare Boris and Henry VIII and how many different things there were and strange historic patterns. And I just went off on this enormous great thing. And as a result of that, things that I already know back in 2014, because I came back round to them again, they in a different way, they settled very, very powerfully in my head. And at the moment, I'm writing a book about Colin Wilson, and that's involved engaging a lot with T.C. Lethbridge and all of the dowsing work that he did, you know. And I'd seen Merlin Coverley's book on Hauntology, fairly recent one, and I'd seen that he talked about Lethbridge in there, and I thought, well, that's my excuse. I've been meaning to have a look at that book. I'm just going to read it and see where I get to with it. Now, absolutely brilliant book. Really, really liked it. But there was something in there that triggered me in relation to the knowledge that I already had from history and myth. He mentions Mircea Eliade. He mentions Eliade's book, The Sacred and the Profane, and all the stuff that he has to say about it is very interesting. But I realised that from my own reading of Eliade, because he was like set text when I was doing a degree in the study of religion way back in the 80s, that there were some distinctions there. And we're going back now to this spectre of Marxism. And what Derrida, the terminology used, and how that echoes what Marx had originally said in 1848. Now, I suddenly got an expanded perspective on what that potentially was all about. And you know, how far you can run with this is I guess, a measure of whether this idea is a goer or not. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about Eliade, you know, when I did this degree in the comparative religion, you know, we studied the writings of Marx on religion, but it's interesting that the telescope works both ways, because Eliade had some very, very interesting things to say about Marxism from the point of view of a historian of religion. And you can find some of this in his book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, and you can also find some of it in Myths, Dreams and Mysteries. And this all goes back to, there's an idea that's very, very potent in European culture and European spirituality right from the earliest times. And it's the idea of cycles of different ages. You know, you've got it in the Greek Hesiod. You've got this idea of a golden age, the Saturnian age, a time when, you know, there's no private property and everybody is just eating nuts and berries and completely and utterly chilled, and it's paradisiacal. And then a series of events occur which gradually take you away from that pristine purity. And this kind of golden age thing is run all the way through, you know, the classical period, and is still present in the background, you know, even in the literature of the Middle Ages. Added to it is from Christianity, the Edenic God, you know, the whole Garden of Eden thing, and the fact that, you know, the fall from the Garden of Eden. And then in the early days of the church, you've got the apostles, when the Holy Spirit comes down on them. They're all living with all their stuff together, you know, in a state of a kind of primitive communism. You know, they're sharing all of their stuff. And through the Middle Ages, there is a constant upheaval where people are being inspired by those ideas and trying to get it back again. Now, one of my favourite books is The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, who's a Marxist historian who has gone into the history of a whole bunch of crazy-ass millennial cults that arose in the course of the Middle Ages, and basically tried, you know, you can see it in retrospect as a kind of proto-revolutionary Marxism. They're trying to overthrow capitalism. You know, they're infused with a combination of this Garden of Eden, early Christianity, and the end game, Book of Revelation, you know, New Jerusalem, and the fact that you're going to take all the sinners, you're going to take all the people with all the money, the 1%ers, and you're going to chuck them in the lake of fire, and then everything is going to be, you know, pretty much hunky-dory after that. And the Brethren of the Free Spirit, you know, a whole bunch of heretics, you know, are present all the way through European history. And what Eliade makes clear is, in fact, the extent to which the ideas of Marxism, in fact, mirror the schemata of these ancient ideas but the archetype of the golden age is kind of hanging there. That primitive communism is like the Garden of Eden and the Golden Age and so forth, and the fall is like where ownership and capital comes in, and just on a popular consciousness level, it's like when the saints go marching in is replaced by when the proletariat go marching in, and so forth. Now, what I came to feel about hauntology was that part of the spectre is the spectre of the golden age and the lost utopias. It's the spectre of all of the potential, so all the social and spiritual experiments that have occurred down through the ages that have had so much potential and have quite often just ended, they certainly did in the Middle Ages, in appalling bloodshed. It's there in the Peasants' Revolt, but it's very, very pertinent, I feel, with the English Civil War. There's a book by a guy called Christopher Hill, who is also a Marxist historian, called The World Turned Upside Down. And rather than it just being about, okay, Roundheads and Cavaliers, it's about the incredible amount of diverse ideas concerning, how society should be run, how we should all live with each other, that were erupting out that period of time, absolutely erupting out of it. And every single one of them represents a kind of lost utopian vision that had an incredible amount of emotion and intensity, invested in it by people who put their lives on the line. A lot of these people end up dead, or, and this is interesting in terms of some of the things Robert Anton Wilson would say. The heretics just head west. A lot of these people end up crossing the ocean to the New World, and then ultimately they in turn cross across the continent and end up, in California, if you like. It's like there is an escape route. And what's really, really striking about this, for example, in Haight-Ashbury in '67, there was a group called Diggers, who you've probably heard of, who emerged. And they're directly named after one of these groups that sprang out of this nexus of the English Civil War. And their thing was to somehow act out everything's free, free food, free social, free healthcare, free housing. How can they make that happen? And obviously there are all kinds of difficulties, but even attempting to do it, stirs up a whole bunch of stuff. And that made me realise that crucial period, that hauntological nexus, the late 60s and early 70s, what you've got is an enormous, great resurgence of what you had actually had hundreds of years ago, which was, but more so than any period in between, experimental attempts, in communal living, in attitudes towards society, towards money, towards, politics, sexuality, absolutely everything. And it's all up there. And of course, a lot of it is not fulfilled. We've come a long way, but there is still a sense that there is something that has not been fulfilled. And I felt it, first of all, that it was very interesting to expand the perspective back to the time of the English Civil War. I don't think it's an accident that one of the folk horror classics is Witchfinder General. And the most amount of hauntings that you're going to get anywhere is in relation to the Civil War. Civil War battlefields are massively haunted. That whole period has given us these archetypes. And the fact that we engaged in this massive social process where we kill our king, we cut our king's head off, but we replace him with these terrible Puritans and this maniac Oliver Cromwell and his mediocre son. We're left in this terrible situation that we have to invite the monarchy back in. And this is like a massive thing in the timeline of British political consciousness, And I feel that we are literally haunted by it. We're literally haunted by all of that. And what to me was very interesting with the whole Glastonbury Zodiac Earth Mysteries ufology thing, was it made me very aware that with this kind of virtual science fiction extension an amplification of these ideas. You've literally got the idea of a golden age now. You know, Atlantis 10,000 years ago, ETs all over the place, ETs building the Great Pyramid, blah, blah, blah. And the idea, the emotional tone that infuses people that are so given over to these ideas is that can come back again. You know, that was kind of there, you know, with the esoteric millennium of 2012, that people kind of still do feel that that is something that is actually going to happen. And and that infuses a whole enormous great culture. So that was all a fascinating consideration to me. And I also felt that as well as expanding that kind of idea to accommodate, you know, earlier time periods, the 70s thing, there are, I think, since then, some really fascinating little areas of time that actually fit the same kind of coordinates. Writing in Avalonian in and out of Goddess, my late 80s and early 90s were just absolutely off the planet. And reading John Higgs, you know, he says that there's something very mysterious and liminal about the early 90s. And I've been literally in the last couple of days, you know, looking back on some of the music of 1991, 30 years ago. And, you know, things like the Screamadelica album, things like Move Any Mountain by the Shaman and Future Sound of London, Papua New Guinea. And it's like another world. It's like another freaking planet. What it felt like, you know, at that point. And I think because of where we're at now, because of all the lockdowns and all the shit, these emotions and these feelings are really, really strong, and they are inviting us. What are we going to do about it? You know, how are we going to interact with this stuff? So that's, you know, that's it in a nutshell, really.
Well, I mean, just to build on what you were saying there in terms of the music reference, it's not just what it sounded like, you know. And I think really for some of the younger audience who you know, are kind of always like looking backwards to this music, who like wouldn't have understood or wouldn't kind of get their heads around like how jarring dance music was to convention and conventional music just at the start of the 90s. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was massive, right? And obviously there's the drug connection. But beyond that, like just thinking about like the visual aesthetic, like how dance music videos looked, you know, when we had the infancy of like 3D animation and kind of these like amorphic shapes, you know,
Yeah.
moving to music. I mean, it was as close as you could get to what Terence McKenna was describing.
But I
Uh,
was looking at a version, one video of Papua New Guinea by Future Sound of London,
yeah.
and it had Glastonbury tour on it, and it had all this
Hmm.
kind of weird occult, arcane stuff
Yeah.
swirling about, stone circles and so forth. And for heaven's sake, you know, the Shaman actually got a 10-minute Terence McKenna rap into the singles charts. Yeah, that is certainly not something that's going to happen these days. And I think the aesthetic of it, um, based here in Glastonbury, for example, the visuals associated with crop circles, whatever you think about them and what you think about how they got there and what they're all about. There was a kind of, you know, the trance dance music of the time, and that kind of imagery and all the swirly stuff you're talking about. It did set people off. You know, people were, okay, let's go read some Terence McKenna, and people were primed for the more esoteric side of 2012. But clearly, you know, the full fulfillment of what people invested in that not occur. So that feels to me like another kind of another juncture. You know, the first Gulf War was obviously slammed right into the middle of that. It's another time to look at in the same way that hauntology looks at the 70s, I feel.
You mentioned there just briefly about kind of like this time period, how kind of the novelty of what was happening in the early 90s through music and through kind of um the whole dance culture that had evolved in the early 90s. Like, you know, the the sense now. I mean, I'm obviously not a young person. I can't relate to what it's like to be a young person at this moment in time. But you don't see the cultural threads of that similar buoyancy, that similar kind of like, um,
It was very expansive. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, using the acid had something to do with it, but it was
yeah,
a whole bunch of stuff was able to ride on the back of that,
mm,
as ideas had done in the height of the best times in the 60s.
mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm,
and now um, I certainly despair of the massive conspiracism and just density of complete goddamn nonsense. Is
mm-hmm,
just taking people into a hall of mirrors, what RAW would call chapter perilous. And you know, that period of time, the early 90s, almost seems like, you know, KLF obviously were in their prime then as
mm-hmm,
well. There's something about that time that's very, very important. And for me, as someone that keeps diaries, and I've obviously written about that period of time in my life in my books, it's very, very vivid to me. And coming back round to, you know, 30 years after 91. But I'm also quite engaged in 40 years after 81. You know, that was the year of the riots, and I don't know what the hell we're letting ourselves in for here, you know. And that's why I just think it's very important to keep track of
mm,
these patterns. And one of the things I've written about in History and Myth, this golden age thing, there's no question to me that Extinction Rebellion have plugged into that archetype. You know, I think some of them are conscious of it and some of them aren't. But
mm-hmm,
basically, when they're saying, you know, they offer up what is essentially a Marxist critique of Western civilization and say we've got to kind of essentially bring it down. And when they were entering into London and so forth, I was quite interested that, you know, there were commentators in some of the more quality newspapers saying this is like something out of the Middle Ages. And it is a kind of millennial cult, you know, and like that's not necessarily totally wrong. It's just you have to understand where these things have led in the past and how they inflate people's heads and make them go into weird ones. And
mm-hmm.
there's all kinds of dangers at the moment, and we need to be informed with full historical
Mm-hmm.
consciousness and engage in joyful creativity, you know, in order to ward off, you know, balance off
Yeah.
these things.
Well, I mean, I think that joyful creativity is a really is really key. You know, when we look at kind of the the younger generation now, you know, people who've grown up with, you know, not even the internet always being there, but like social media always being there, and like high levels of
Yeah.
connectivity being, you know, always there. Like that's a really, you know, being a like a 90s kid, like, you know, really looking back and go think, well, you know, look around and you think of the technology like that we're talking on now, all that kind of stuff didn't exist. None of it existed. Everyone was walking around those brick phones at this period of
Yeah.
time. When we're talking about like that period of time of like the future sound of London, the music, the talk, what they were talking about, the ideas that they were bringing forth at that time, you know, and the just expansiveness of it. And, you know, not that much later, you had like Grant Morrison doing his uh, you know, his Discord presentation, and like all these kind of really kind of like interesting pop magic ideas that were like
Yeah.
aware of media and aware of culture and dancing with it and kind of turning on his head and playing with it, and, you know, and really, you know, like all the kind of like, you know, brand spiking and ad busting that was happening, that's still happening now. You know, it's just that so much of it is intertwined with deep internet culture that, you know, it just goes over the head of people who aren't ensconced in internet culture, that they don't know what's happening. But one of the weird things that I find, even for kind of like, you got youth culture who have their own world, they have their own language, we still are in this place where, you know, corporations are can be held up as bastions of goodness.
Uh-huh.
You know, and that's a really weird thing. That's a really weird thing. You know, and like the shift between kind of where idealism is in terms of like, you know, how can we get to that golden age? How can we get to a better place? Somehow has got consumerism and, you know, like legacy corporations intertwined with it now in a lot of people's heads. And
It's
like,
been happening ever since the 60s. The
really
consciousness of
weird.
the 60s was co-opted by the wider
Mm,
culture money. It's almost a kind of inevitable thing.
hmm
But this is where I think engaging in the education of history and cultural history is so important
mm,
for for younger generations to see how often we've been around this thing. We're seeing,
hmm
the news that I'm getting here, obviously in Glastonbury, we've had all this trouble in Bristol.
Yeah.
Uh, and as I say, 40 years on from the riots, the summer of riots, we've seen some of my friends, I heard the stories, Windsor Festival, 1974, and onwards, through the miners' strike and the Wapping dispute and on and on. It just keeps coming back round again. It just keeps coming back round again. But what's intriguing about it is I think, I noticed in Glastonbury, um, the stirring of deep historical stuff when the rest of the world was switched off. This is there in my book, History and Myth. But a couple of weeks ago, we had this terrible event in London with vigil for murdered Sarah and how these women were brutalised by the police. There was this picture of this flame-haired girl being held down, and to me, the first thing I thought of was this is like the daughters of Boadicea. This is like the Romans and Boadicea. It's like there's some kind of, in the Metropolitan Police, there's some kind of weird energetic template that just is like all that way back. And I've always felt that, people like Peter Ackroyd and Ian Sinclair, they haven't ignored Boadicea and the events of the burning of London, but I don't think they've really. I've always had a sense that was just, it was gigantic, and it kind of hangs on in there, and those kind of energies still play through the landscape, still play through the collective mind, and I think something was stirring with that a couple of weeks ago, and on the one hand, it's quite exhilarating. On the other hand, it's a danger signal. It's kind of saying, look, the patterns of control, how that works is kind of becoming more and more visible to people.
It is.
Like this is what it is.
I love that idea of cycles through times, and I really, I think the thing that I've really gravitated towards and kind of hung on to in this conversation is that how, or what's come up for me rather, is how creativity fights against empire, and
Yeah,
it's a dance that's been happening all the time, and I think that's,
like is one of the strongest
yeah.
examples.
Mm,
Certainly that got in
mhm,
British culture.
yeah.
There's so much there in that
Mm,
period of time that he went through. That's
yeah. Mhm,
something that's just typical for all history.
yeah. Yeah. So for people who want to find out a bit more about your work and maybe want to read some of your books, what's the best place for them to find out more?
Okay, well, I've got paulwestonglastonbury.com. I haven't put an awful lot up there for a while, but I'm easy enough to find on Facebook. I've got Paul Weston's Avalonian Eon publications. I've got a page for my Aleister Crowley and the Unahorus. All my stuff is available globally on Kindle. A couple of my books have sold out. I haven't got a Cold Back to Britain anymore. I haven't got Out of Gartis anymore, but for people in the UK, I've got all the rest of them. And I do get messages from people around the world who, will PayPal me some extra postage, and I'll post the stuff out
Okay.
there. I'm easy enough to find and get hold of and interact with.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I will dig up the various links and put them in the show notes for the
All right.
listeners to pick up and follow through on. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
All right. Well, here's to some full moon dreaming that extends into the season ahead.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. A big thank you to Paul for his time. I really enjoyed that. It's often the case with these shows that when you get to kind of listen back to the audio when you're editing, that you get an extra level of the depth of the conversation and the richness in the conversation, which I know means that I'll inevitably be getting pulled back on the show to discuss these things in further depth. If you want to find Paul's work, do check the show notes. The link to his website and to his Amazon author page are there, and I encourage you to explore his work further. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks for listening, and talk soon.